Hello everyone! Alongside the Pyro Archon, Citlali from the Masters of the Night one will also be releasing in Genshin patch 5.3. As the newest addition to Cryo, an element that hasn't gotten too much love from HOYOverse for a long time, Citlali has some big shoes to fill in order to bring Cryo back to the spotlight. And fortunately, she's looking like a very strong support, making her perhaps the strongest Cryo character we've seen so far. So I wanted to sum up all the updated information you need to know about Citlali into one final guide. I will be explaining how Citlali works, the best ways to build her potential best teams, and analyzing her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. Pretty much everything you need to know with simple and practical explanations, while also giving more detailed analysis that is backed by TC, as I will be showcasing calcs from theory crafters that demonstrate Citlali's strength. Citlali is a 5-star Cryo Catalyst user that ascends with Elemental Mastery. Notably, Citlali is going to have the second lowest base attack in the game with 127. Citlali's kit is designed to be an off-field Cryo support that applies AoE Cryo onto enemies, grants a small shield, and deals a little bit of damage, and all of these benefits scale off Elemental Mastery. In addition, Citlali also provides res shred for hydro and power units that play around the freeze or melt reactions, bringing a much needed buff for freeze and melt oriented teams. The majority of Citlali's kit revolves around her elemental skill. It has a 16-second cooldown, and after using it, Citlali deals AoE cryo damage, generates 5 cryo particles, and creates a cryo shield that scales off her Elemental Mastery. This shield has a 20-second duration, but the shield's HP isn't very high. Based on a shield HP comparison done by hyperwebster, Citlali's shield is one of the weaker ones in the game. At talent level 9 with about 650 EM from double EM main stats and substats, her shield only has about 9000 HP, which is weaker than a full HP Diona shield, and Diona's shield isn't considered very strong. Citlali's shield only really gets decent at higher investment in maximizing EM, so don't expect Citlali's shield to allow you to face tank a multitude of attacks like Zhongli's can. It will just provide some safety and resistance to interruption from a few hits. The shield isn't the main part of the skill, however. Using Citlali's skill also summons its Papa, her angry little pillow, for 20 seconds and makes Citlali enter Nightsoul's Blessing with 24 Nightsoul points. Once Citlali has at least 50 Nightsoul points, its Papa creates a Frostfall Storm, which is a large field that follows the active character and deals cryo damage to all enemies within the field. This does damage every second and has an elemental ICD of every other hit. This is Citlali's source of off-field AoE cryo application. The field consumes 8 Nightsoul points every second and will disappear once Citlali runs out of Nightsoul points. Using Citlali's skill generates 24 Nightsoul points, but it requires 50 to activate her off-field cryo application. So how does Citlali get more Nightsoul points? Well, her Elemental Burst is another source of Nightsoul points. Citlali's burst has a 15-second cooldown and deals 1 hit of AoE cryo damage while granting 24 Nightsoul points for Citlali. In addition, up to 3 additional skulls can spawn near up to 3 enemies, dealing additional damage and giving Citlali another 3 Nightsoul points for each skull. So in single target, Citlali's burst gives 27 Nightsoul points. With skill and burst alone, Citlali can activate her off-field AoE cryo application from her skill. However, Citlali's passive talents also generate Nightsoul points to extend the duration of her off-field cryo app. With Citlali's A1, while its Papa is on the field, whenever the party triggers either freeze or melt on an enemy, that enemy's pyro and hydro resistance gets decreased by 20% for 12 seconds. Activating this passive also gives 16 Nightsoul points, which can happen every 8 seconds. Thus, as long as you consistently trigger the passive, Citlali's A1 gives her 32 Nightsoul points every rotation. This passive is the reason Citlali will be played around freeze or melt reactions, as not only are the Nightsoul points important to maintain her off-field cryo app, but the pyro and hydro res shred she provides is a great buff for pyro and hydro damage dealers. With Citlali's A4 passive, every time Nightsoul burst is triggered, Citlali gains 4 Nightsoul points. Citlali's A4 also increases the damage of her off-field cryo damage hits and elemental burst initial hit by 90% and 1200% of Citlali's elemental mastery respectively. The EM scaling on Citlali's elemental burst is more significant, allowing her to deal a decent nuke of damage if you trigger a reaction like melt with it to multiply its scaling. Thus, if we add up all of the available Nightsoul points she can gain within a rotation, we get a total of 91 Nightsoul points. And since its Papa's Frostfall Storm consumes 8 Nightsoul points per second, the duration of Citlali's off-field AoE cryo application will be about 11 seconds. Remember that the cryo field attacks enemies every second and every other hit applies cryo. Thus, every rotation should have 11 instances of damage with 6 instances of cryo application. Lastly, Citlali's exploration passives are very similar to Auroron's. She can perform a super jump, glide around, and target Night Spirit graffiti and sigils by aiming at them. In addition, triggering Nightsoul Burst with Citlali in the party restores 20 phlogiston in the overworld. That's everything on Citlali's base kit. In terms of talent leveling priority, I would suggest prioritizing her skill first to make the shield a bit stronger, then burst if you want to optimize its damage. Ultimately, however, Citlali's shield will be somewhat weak regardless of level, and the majority of the burst's damage comes from the EM multiplier that comes from her A4. Thus, leveling her talents in general isn't too important, as even if they aren't that highly leveled, Citlali still enables reactions and provides her buffs to a team. The details of activating Citlali's cryo application is somewhat complicated, but her actual gameplay is very simple. In most general rotations, you'll use your other support skills first, then swap to Citlali to use her skill, then her burst, then swap to your main DPS. Some rotations may add an additional normal attack after Citlali's burst. Depending on the timing of Citlali's cryo app and your ping, this may help set up certain reactions for some teams. Generally, however, I don't think you need to worry about this unless you find that it helps you in your own gameplay. The most important thing about playing Citlali is just playing her in a team that triggers freeze or melts. Now, let's cover Citlali's constellations. The TLDR of Citlali C1 is that after using her skill, it gives the active character increased damage to any of their attacks, scaling off of Citlali's elemental mastery. This additional damage works the same way as Chen has quills. Assuming your team triggers freeze and melts, C1 buffs up to 16 hits. Some nice additional damage, but nothing too crazy. C1 also decreases Citlali's phlogiston consumption when she leaps in the air and aims in the air. C2 allows Citlali to shield other teammates as well, useful for multiplayer. In addition, it gives Citlali herself 125 elemental mastery, as well as any character who is shielded by Citlali's shield or has its papa following them 250 EM. On top of that, she gives an additional 20% pyro and hydro res shred against enemies that were frozen or melted, a very strong constellation that gives Citlali even more buffs to her elemental skill. C3 increases her skill talent level by 3, C4 gives Citlali an additional EM scaling nuke of damage that restores 16 night soul points and 8 energy for Citlali, which can occur every 8 seconds when enemies are hit by her skill's off-field cryo damage. Nice for her personal damage, increases Citlali's off-field cryo application from 11 seconds to 15 seconds and heavily eases her ER requirements. C5 increases her burst talent level by 3, and lastly C6 allows Citlali's skill to immediately activate her off-field cryo app when used, and it will continue existing even when she doesn't have any remaining night soul points. In addition, when Citlali's skill is used, it will consume all her night soul points instead and will continually consume night soul points. Draining these night soul points gives stacks, and these stacks can give the team up to 60% pyro and hydro damage bonus, as well as up to 100% damage bonus for Citlali herself. Overall, in terms of buffing Citlali's supportive capabilities, her C2 will be the best constellation to go for if you're looking for some vertical investment. The additional res shred to pyro and hydro is great, and 250 EM to your team is an amazing buff for melt teams. But otherwise, Citlali's constellations aren't too crazy, and she looks like a very solid unit just at C0. Next, here are the best builds for Citlali. Her signature weapon will be her best general choice. It gives a total of 365 EM for Citlali and gives the team 28% damage bonus for 15 seconds after she creates a shield with her elemental skill. With the amount of EM it gives, this weapon will be the best for maximizing Citlali's personal damage and shield HP, along with providing a nice team buff. Nahida's signature is also another solid 5-star weapon choice for Citlali, specifically for teams who can take advantage of its EM buff. However, both of Citlali's 5-star options aren't that much ahead of her other weapon choices, even her best 3-star free-to-play option, TTDS. 48% attack to your main DPS is a lot, and even though in most rotations the attack buff is only active every other rotation, it's still not that much behind the buff from Citlali's signature. The downside to TTDS is that without an EM substat, Citlali's personal damage and shield HP take a hit. However, Citlali's buffs are more important to a team. Because this 3-star weapon is readily available for everyone and doesn't even need to be leveled, I highly recommend using this weapon if you are willing to play around a proper rotation that plays around its passive. Other solid weapons include Wandering Evenstar. At R5, its buff is comparable to TTDS on top of having an EM substat and not requiring a specific rotation to utilize its attack buff. The Sumeru Craftable, Fruit of Fulfillment, and Favonius Codex are decent options that help meet Citlali's ER requirements. However, if you're struggling with Citlali's energy, I recommend using Sacrificial Fragments instead. Along with an EM substat, being able to use Citlali's skill twice will generate double the energy and night soul points. This can be valuable in speedruns to skip her burst animation, as you won't need to use the burst for the extra night soul points to activate her off-field cryo app. Here is a complete weapon comparison made by hyperwebster for Citlali in a Mahuika melt team. As you can see, the difference between the 5-star weapons and the other options aren't that large in terms of team damage, so you won't be losing very much if you decide not to pull on the weapon banner. In terms of artifacts, Citlali is an off-field natlan support, so 4-piece scroll is her obvious best set. The 2-piece helps with her energy, and the 4-piece team damage bonus after triggering a reaction is just so strong. If you have another scroll user on the team, you could use 4-piece Tenacity of the Bililith or 4-piece Instructor. However, because Citlali has relatively high ER requirements, I highly suggest keeping Citlali on 4-piece scroll and switching your other scroll holder to another set. For instance, is, if you have both Citlali and Xilonen on a team, use Scroll on Citlali and use a set like Archaic Petra on Xilonen. For artifact stats, EM or ER Hourglass depending on your energy needs, Cryo Damage or EM Goblet, and EM or Crit Rate Circlet. EM Hourglass, Cryo Damage Goblet, and EM Circlet is your general best main stack combo for both a decent shield and personal damage, but if you need the ER, you should generally run ER Hourglass, EM Goblet, and EM Circlet. The differences aren't too drastic though. For substats, prioritize ER until you have enough, then EM. After that, Crit is the only useful substat to optimize Citlali's personal damage, so you can then look for crit rate, then crit damage, but it's generally not that important. ER and EM substats should be your main focus. For energy requirements, if Citlali isn't on 4P Scroll, then she'll need about 220 ER. If she is on 4P Scroll, then this gets lowered to about 180 to 190 ER. However, if she's also being played with Xilonen on the team, who provides extra Night Soul burst and thus extra energy from the 2 piece of scroll, Citlali will need about 160 ER. Finally, let's go over Citlali's best team comps. Because of Citlali's A1 passive, Citlali will be used as a support for her off-field cryo application in teams that can trigger freeze or melt to buff pyro and hydro DPSs with her pyro and hydro res shred and 4P scroll. And while these benefits are somewhat specific, Citlali is quite a strong buffer in this niche. As the support for pyro and hydro DPSs, Citlali is comparable to Zhongli, as both are shielders that give the same amount of res shred. The main difference is that Zhongli's shield is much stronger for gameplay comfort, but while Citlali's shield is weaker, she provides more buffs with 4P scroll, can potentially bring more personal damage by melting her burst, and provides off-field cryo application which can help drive a team's reactions. And while Xilonen is technically a better buffer than both since she provides even more res shred, Citlali sort of serves as a middle ground between the two in terms of buffing and defensive utility for pyro and hydro DPSs. First, freeze teams can use Citlali well. Generally, double hydro freeze teams will benefit more because Citlali provides hydro res shred but not cryo res shred. So for example, using Citlali over Zhongli in a Nivulette team gives you a weaker shield in exchange for more damage on Nivulette and Farina. However, even though Citlali doesn't provide cryo res shred, she can still be played in a typical freeze team with the cryo DPS like Ayaka, Ganyu, and Wriothesley just because she can provide the full 4P scroll damage buff to the cryo carry. Citlali can also fit into existing vape teams, turning them into vape melt teams. For example, she's a good option for the old school Hu Tao double hydro team over Zhongli, providing more buffs for everyone at the cost of a smaller shield. Similarly, the standard Arlecchino vape team that typically uses Zhongli can use Citlali instead to buff Arlecchino and the off-field hydro while also allowing Citlali to melt her burst. In addition, Chaska teams get buffed by Citlali as well. Since Chaska can deal both hydro and pyro damage herself depending on the team, she can take full advantage of Citlali's res shred as well as benefit from 4P scroll. Removing the hydro slot and slotting in Mawika also results in a very strong team just focused on melts. Although not all of Chaska's teammates will be different elements in this team, so her charged attacks will receive less damage bonus and she'll potentially lose an elemental bullet from her A1 passive, it's still a buff in team damage. Here are some extensive C0 and C1 Chaska team calcs with builds, rotations, and assumptions made by theory crafter Sensi, who has done a lot of good TC work on Chaska ever since her beta. Big takeaway here is that Citlali looks to be a strict upgrade for current Chaska teams. Lastly, Citlali's best teams where she's looking to shine the most are where she enables forward melt for pyro carries like Mawika and Arlecchino. Citlali's cryo application alone is not enough to allow a pyro DPS to consistently melt all their attacks. For example, in Mawika's case, Citlali is only able to allow Mawika to melt her burst hit and 2 charged attacks consistently. But despite this, Citlali is still a very strong melt enabler due to the damage buffs and res shred she provides. The best melt teams are looking to also run Xilonen and Bennett since they are also very strong buffers. However, you can also use an animal support like Sucrose or a second off-field cryo sub DPS like Rosaria or Kaya instead of either Xilonen or Bennett. Sucrose is generally better than Kazuha because of the value of EM and melt, though Kazuha can still be used. Running double cryo allows you to potentially melt more attacks, but you do lose out on buffs and have to deal with other issues such as Rosaria's circle or Kaya's low range. These melt teams can also set up Citlali's burst to be melted as well, bringing in some extra damage. Here are some in-depth team DPS calcs done by hyperwebster for various Mawika melt teams with Citlali. If you're interested in the specific builds, rotations, and assumptions used, feel free to pause the video. Overall, Citlali is a great support for all types of melt teams. Citlali especially synergizes well with Mawika because her Night Soul point consumption allows for enough fighting spirit for Mawika to use her empowered burst. Citlali is also able to consistently melt Mawika's burst hit, which makes up a large portion of her damage. This duo makes a surprisingly strong team core that can fit into a lot of teams that you may not expect. For example, while the best Kenichi teams are typically focused on burning, Citlali and Mawika can actually fit into the team, allowing for Mawika to melt her burst while maintaining burning uptime afterwards. A potentially a great option for non-Emily havers. Next, Milani can theoretically use the Citlali and Mawika duo. However, this team is unintuitive because it requires Citlali to not be completely leveled and ignores activating her off-field cryo application. This is to ensure that Mawika melts her burst and that there isn't any cryo left to mess up Milani vaping from Mawika's pyro application, allowing Citlali to buff both Milani's and Mawika's damage with a res shred. So while in theory this is one of Milani's best teams on paper, I wouldn't recommend this team for general play, but for those looking to hyper optimize. Lastly, Wriothesley or Ayaka melt teams can technically get buffed by slotting in both Citlali and Mawika. Even though Citlali doesn't provide cryo res shred to Wriothesley or Ayaka, she buffs Mawika's damage so much that these teams turn into Mawika teams, where Wriothesley and Ayaka help drive melts for Mawika. To conclude this Citlali guide, I wanted to share my analysis on her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. Citlali isn't a support that you can put into any team and she'll be good. Her teams require triggering freeze or melts, and she specifically provides res shred to only pyro and hydro damage. But even though Citlali is more niche as a support, she is very strong in this niche. If we lay out everything Citlali can provide, we can see that she gives a shield, pyro and hydro res shred, 40% damage bonus from 4P scroll, easy to access off-field cryo application, and potentially a small burst nuke for extra damage if you are able to melt it. Now yes, her shield is relatively weak when compared to most of the shielders in the game, as even Diona's shield is stronger than Citlali's, but even a small shield can be helpful for tanking some hits and providing some resistance to interruption. Ultimately, however, Citlali's shield is just a small portion of what she can provide to a team. Her multitude of additional buffs on top of her shield, off-field cryo application, and potential personal damage is the main reason Citlali is such a strong support for the teams that can use her. In a way, Citlali serves as the middle ground between Xilonin's damage buffs and Zhongli's defensive utility, allowing for a bit of both worlds. Citlali can be good in freeze teams even when the carry is cryo due to 4P scroll, and she's a good option for vape melt, acting as an alternative to Zhongli. But her main value comes from enabling forward melt teams for pyro main DPSs. Forward melt teams has always existed in the game, especially in speedruns, but for general use, most melt teams relied on Rosaria and Orkaya. And while the team is alright, it was ultimately limited by the cryo options. With Citlali's release, forward melt looks like a very strong team now due to the buff she brings to the team archetype, making it way more meta relevant. This is especially true for the Citlali Mawika pairing, who can potentially be played in a multitude of teams, bringing in a large amount of damage through Mawika's melted burst. Considering HOYOverse is putting both Citlali and Mawika's banner at the same time, I'm sure they are aware of this synergy. Ultimately, however, Citlali's pull value depends heavily on whether you want a powerful forward melt team enabler for your account, along with having a decent support option for vape melt and freeze teams. Even though she's a cryo unit, Citlali's kit doesn't directly benefit most existing cryo units other than being a 4P scroll holder. However, I do think Citlali's release does buff the cryo element as a whole by addressing its biggest issue. If we look at the current cryo character roster, we can see that the biggest problem with cryo is that most of the character options aren't very good in the meta. A good portion of cryo characters are healers or shielders, and while they do have their place, they ultimately fall short in terms of team damage. Most of the limited 5-star cryo DPSs are unfortunately outdated in terms of their numbers, especially when you compare them to newer release carries. And in terms of off-field cryo supports, while they are okay, they are also limited and outdated, as more recent general supports provide way more buffs or personal damage, and you would likely rather use them over the cryo options. Citlali is the first cryo support that actually provides meaningful buffs and utility to a team, allowing her to make forward melt, a cryo related team, very strong in the meta. Her buffs like her res shred are not only comparable to other supports in the game, but her buffs are also unique and special to her, like being able to hold 4P scroll and providing off-field cryo application as well. Thus, I don't think it's a stretch to say that Citlali is going to be the best cryo unit in the game with her supportive capabilities, and this might be one of the best kind of buffs that the cryo element can get, getting more newly released characters that are actually strong, incentivizing us to play cryo characters and cryo related teams. Citlali is by no means a must pull, as you may not be able to take advantage of the niche she strengthens with your character roster, but if you have characters like Mawika that can take advantage of Citlali enabling forward melt teams, or you want a good option for existing vape melt and freeze teams, Citlali can be a valuable pull for you, and I wouldn't be surprised if this forward melt team archetype continues to get expanded in the future. And that's everything I wanted to cover about Citlali. Big thanks to hyperwebster, Sensi, and vomfee for doing all the theory crafting and math behind the calcs presented in this video and granting me permission to showcase them. They all do great TC work. I hope this guide and analysis was helpful to you all in giving you a better understanding of everything related to Citlali. Just clicking and watching the video helps the channel immensely, and if you want to show even more support, consider liking or sharing the video, or feel free to click the subscribe button for more pre-release analysis videos in the future. Leave any questions in the comments, and for all of you planning on wishing, I wish you all the best of luck on your Citlali pulls.